Welcome back to B-Side Chronicles. I'm Chris. This is the channel where we go as deep as the story demands into the real histories behind the music that shaped American culture. Every episode is built from the ground up, no shortcuts, no surface level. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone who watched my last episode through to the end and liked and subscribed to the channel. I would love to see this channel continue to grow. With that being said, I know it's been a while since I posted episode 1. I am, as you are probably aware, doing this in my spare time, and the research alone takes quite a bit of effort and time, much less recording the narration or creating the music and images, even with those being AI generated. I want to assure you that I am creating these episodes as quickly as possible and hope you remain excited about the upcoming episodes. If you were with us for episode 1, we spent just over an hour getting to know 6 musicians individually, their childhoods, their struggles, the separate roads that eventually pointed them all towards the same room in Jacksonville, Florida. The 6 of them walked in as strangers. By the time that afternoon was over, something had locked into place that none of them had a language for yet. They played together, and they didn't stop, and they didn't leave, and inside of a few days, they had a name. Before we get into episode 2, I need to make a correction from episode 1. I stated that Phil Walden used insurance money from Otis Redding's death to fund Capricorn Records. Through the deeper research I did for this episode, what the evidence actually shows is that Capricorn was funded through Walden's relationship with Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records. The insurance money story is the kind of thing that gets passed around long enough that it starts to feel like an established fact, but it isn't. It should never have made it into the script, and that's on me. The research integrity of this channel is something that I take seriously enough to say it out loud when I get something wrong. Now, episode 2. This episode is what happened next. 6 musicians, a broke record label, a grieving manager, a rundown farmhouse on a Georgia lake, and the 10 days inside an Atlantic Records studio in New York City that produced one of the most important debut albums in the history of Southern music. And then, a chance meeting in Miami that none of them planned, with a guitarist you've absolutely heard of. A meeting that produced something that has never been matched. This is episode 2. The Brotherhood begins. Macon, Georgia, 1969. Today the city sits around 150,000 people. In 1969 it was closer to 120,000. Mid-sized, southern, sitting at the bend of the Ocmulgee River, roughly 80 miles south of Atlanta. It had a proud musical past. Little Richard had grown up here, had gone from dishwasher at the Greyhound bus station to the most electrifying performer alive on these same streets. But by 1969, that moment had passed, and Macon was a city still trying to figure out what came next. Into this city in the spring of 1969 came 6 long-haired musicians who had no money and no national reputation, piling their lives into a 1-bedroom apartment belonging to their road manager. Their road manager had a dream that went well beyond the band. He wanted to build a record label, a studio, a creative home for Southern music the way Stax had done for Memphis, the way Fame had done for Muscle Shoals. He wanted to prove that the South could produce its own thing on its own terms. And the building he wanted to do it in had a story of its own. A few blocks from where the band would make their home stood a building at 535 Cotton Avenue, the Red Wall Music Building. The name was a combination: Red for Redding, Otis Redding; Wall for Walden, the Walden brothers, Phil and Alan, who built their entire careers around Otis. Otis Redding was a Macon man. Born in Dawson, Georgia in 1941, he moved to Macon with his family as a young child. He grew up in the Tyndall Heights housing project, sang in the choir at Vineville Baptist Church where his father preached, and started winning local talent shows, 15 straight at Macon's Douglas Theater, after which the theater banned him from competing. He dropped out of Ballard Hudson High School at 15 to help support his family. Macon made him. He never really left. The Walden brothers were Macon kids too. Phil was the older of the two, and Allman was 3 years younger. Phil and Otis had been friends in high school. Phil was a white teenager who had built his entire emotional and creative world around black music, in a state where that kind of connection across the color line could get you shunned, threatened, or worse. Years later, Otis's widow, Zelma, described what Phil walked through to do what he did. She called him the little white boy who everyone was wanting to beat up on. When Otis needed a manager, he chose Phil. They were both teenagers. The year was 1959. Phil opened an office in downtown Macon, the Phil Walden Artist and Promotion Agency, while he was still a sophomore at Mercer University. Otis helped him paint the walls. In the summer of 1963, Phil was commissioned as a second lieutenant to the United States Army through a deferred service program and shipped out to Germany. He handed the business to his younger brother Alan, then a sophomore at Mercer himself, and asked him to keep the lights on until he got back. Alan did more than that. He grew it. While Phil was overseas, Alan kept Otis on the road, managed dozens of other black artists, and turned the company into one of the largest black artist management agencies in the South. Phil came home in 1965. The three of them, Phil, Alan, and Otis, co-founded a publishing company together that same year. They called it Red Wall Music, one of the first integrated businesses in Macon, Georgia. The name on the building was their name, all three of them, compressed into 6 letters. Allman Walden later described what the partnership felt like. When Phil and Otis and me sat down for a meeting, we had a triangular brain. On December 10th, 1967, Phil Walden was in a Las Vegas hotel at a music industry convention when the phone rang. His brother Alan was on the line. "Otis's plane has gone down," Alan said. "They're still looking for him. It doesn't look good." Phil hung up, walked to the elevator to go back up to his room. A disc jockey at the convention recognized him in the elevator, didn't know what had just happened, and asked him a question. He said, "Hey, what are you and Otis going to do with all that loot you're getting?" Phil didn't answer. By the next morning, the world knew. Otis Redding's Beechcraft had gone down in Lake Monona, 4 miles short of the Madison, Wisconsin runway in poor visibility. He was 26 years old. He was on his way to a club gig that night at a Madison venue called The Factory. 3 days before, he had recorded a song with Steve Cropper at Stack Studio called "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay." It would be released the following month and become the biggest hit of his career, #1 on both the pop and R&B charts. He never heard it on the radio. Allman Walden, in an interview later, "The whole world stopped cold for me that day. My star and my best friend were gone. I had never known pain like that. He was the first man I loved outside of my immediate family." Phil didn't talk about it the way Alan did. He took nearly 2 years off from music entirely. When he came back with a plan. He went to Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records, the man who had been his partner in the soul music world for years, and asked for help building something in Macon. Wexler liked the idea and pushed it further. Atlantic would back not just a studio, but a full record label, with Phil running it out of Macon. They called it Capricorn Records, after the astrological sign Phil and Wexler shared. The building they based it in was Otis's building. His name was in the walls. What Phil needed now was a flagship act, someone who could make Capricorn mean something, someone who could carry the music forward. He found him in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. The Deal, Walden, Wexler, and Duane. By 1968, Duane Allman had made himself into one of the most sought-after session guitarists in American music. Working out of Rick Hall's famed studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, he had played on sessions with Wilson Pickett, King Curtis, and a growing list of artists who asked for him by name. His work on Wilson Pickett's version of Hey Jude had traveled far enough to reach London. Jerry Wexler, the architect of the Atlantic Records sound, the man who had signed Aretha Franklin and produced Ray Charles, heard what Duane was doing in that studio and understood it immediately. He saw not just a gifted session player, but the foundation of something larger. Wexler introduced Walden to Duane. Walden, fresh from the wreckage of Otis Redding's death and hungry to build something new, saw in Duane exactly what he needed. Wexler had already bought Duane's recording contract from Rick Hall for Atlantic. Now he sold it on to Walden, partnered with him, and the two set about creating the vehicle, Capricorn Records, an Atlantic subsidiary built around Duane as its creative cornerstone. There is a producer whose name runs through almost every major story in this episode. Before we go any further, he deserves a proper introduction. Tom Dowd had been Atlantic Records' house engineer since the label's early days. The list of records he had built reads like a map of the 20th century in American music. Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding, John Coltrane, The Drifters, Cream. He had been there for all of it, not as a passive technician, but as a creative collaborator who understood the music at a molecular level. What most people didn't know was that before any of that, Tom Dowd had worked on the atomic bomb. He graduated from high school in New York at 16 with an aptitude for both math and music. He took a job at Columbia University's Pupin Physics Laboratory while he was still in high school. At 18, he was drafted into the Army Corps of Engineers, but instead of being sent overseas, he was sent back to Columbia with orders that read Manhattan District. Pupin Lab was one of the secret hubs of the Manhattan Project. Dowd operated a cyclotron particle accelerator. He performed density tests on uranium and other elements. He worked with the Neutron Beam Spectrography Division, recording statistics for research whose ultimate purpose was classified. He didn't know what his work was being used for until 1945 when the bombs fell on Japan. The following year, he was sent to Bikini Atoll in the Pacific to observe 2 American nuclear tests at close range. When the war ended, Columbia refused to give him academic credit for any of it. The work was still classified, so he walked away from his physics degree, took a summer job at a Manhattan recording studio, and never looked back. He was in the most literal sense a man who understood how things split apart and how they came back together. At Atlantic Records, Dowd became the engineer who pushed the entire industry into the modern era. He didn't invent the multi-track recording, Les Paul did, but Dowd was the one who seen what it could become. He convinced Jerry Wexler to buy Atlantic, the second 8-track recorder ever built, making Atlantic the first recording label in America to record on multiple tracks. He designed and built Atlantic's first stereo and 8-track mixing consoles. And because he was a piano player who liked the idea of controlling multiple voices at once, he replaced the standard rotary knobs on his mixing board with sliding faders, the first time anyone had done that on a recording console. Every sliding fader on every studio mixing board on Earth today traces back to Tom Dowd's frustration with knobs. He would become the Allman Brothers Band's most important studio collaborator. But the first time the band tried to record, he wasn't there. The session guitarist, Duane outside of the band. Duane was the best guitarist in the room at nearly every session he walked into, and the word on him had spread far enough that producers and artists were now requesting him by name. Walden and Wexler were building a label around him. But before the band that label was waiting for ever reached the studio, Duane logged 2 sessions as a hired gun that belong in this story, because both of them walked back into it later. Through the winter of 1968 and spring of 1969, Duane Allman was living 2 lives. One was the life taking shape in Jacksonville, the jams with the 2 drummers, the 2 guitars, the bass player, and the brother he called home from California. The other was the life that came through the telephone. The calls were from New York and Sheffield and eventually Miami. And when the phone rang, Duane got on a plane or in a car and went wherever Jerry Wexler needed him to be. Then he came home and got back to building the band. He had been living that double life since the previous fall, and it would not stop until October of 1971. The mechanics of how that happened, the picket session at Fame, the phone call from Rick Hall to Jerry Wexler, the recording contract changing hands had been told in the first episode and doesn't need retelling here. What matters for this story is what it had built. By January of 1969, Duane Allman was a name that producers in the American R&B industry passed to each other in shorthand. He was the player you called when you wanted a song to do something it had not yet done. He had a reputation, he had a price, and he had a nickname. He had 2 nicknames, actually. They merged into one. The first was Dog. Rick Hall, who signed him at Fame, had been calling him that for months. Hall told the story in his own words years later to the writer Tom Paul. He said Duane looked like an old hound dog with his big ears and hanging down white hair. Other accounts described the look slightly different, the long sideburns, the strawberry blonde mane, the way the hair fell across his face when he was leaning into a phrase. The portraits don't agree on every detail, but they agree on the silhouette. He was 22 years old and looked like nothing else in the room. He wore the hair like a flag. The second nickname was Skyman, and there are 2 versions of how it came to him. The first, the one that has lived inside the Allman family lore and inside most published accounts, is that Wilson Pickett gave it to him for the way he played. Duane closed his eyes when he soloed and raised his hand towards the sky. He looked like a man reaching for something that was above him in the room. Pickett, who had been around guitarists his whole life, hadn't seen that before and started calling Duane Skyman because Duane played like a man trying to touch the sky. Rick Hall remembered it differently. In his telling, also given to Tom Paul and printed in the same source as the Dog story, the name had a less romantic origin. Pickett, Hall said, called Duane Skyman because Duane liked to get high. He'd disappear into the bathroom between takes, come back to the mic with his pupils enormous, and play better than he had any business playing. Hall's version is earthier. It is also the recollection of a man who owned the studio. Both versions exist in the documented record. Either could be the root. The name itself is the same, either way. Pickett had given him Skyman. Hall had been calling him Dog. Somewhere in late 1968 or early 1969, the 2 ran together. Sky Dog. It stuck. It was on the credits of every record he made for the rest of his life. By the new year, he was Sky Dog to everyone in the business who mattered. He was Sky Dog to Hall, to Wexler, and to the Muscle Shoals rhythm section, and to the engineers who recorded his tracks at the Atlantic Studios in New York. The recording contract that Hall had signed with him in November of 1968, a 5-year deal for $10,000, had already been sold to Atlantic. Wexler had bought it after hearing the Pickett record over the telephone. Some accounts of this period, including some that had circulated for decades, placed the contract with Liberty Records, the label that carried Duane and Gregg's earlier band, Hourglass. The Liberty story is in print in several places. However, the weight of the more careful research points to Fame, to Rick Hall, to the 5-year session deal, to the $10,000 buyout by Wexler. That is the contract that mattered. That is the contract that would, within 6 months, change hands again when Atlantic sold it to Phil Walden's new Capricorn Records label, where Duane would lead a band of his own choosing. But that was all later. In January of 1969, the contract still belonged to Atlantic, and the first call to come down the line from Wexler was a call worth getting on a plane for. On the 9th of January 1969, almost 3 months before the Allman Brothers Band held its first rehearsal in Jacksonville, Duane Allman walked into Atlantic Studios in New York City for an Aretha Franklin session. The song was The Wait, the Robbie Robertson composition that had been released 6 months earlier on the band's debut album, Music from Big Pink. The band's original had been a creeping communal thing, 5 voices passing the verses around like a story being told at a kitchen table. It had not been a major hit single in the United States. It peaked at number 63 on the Hot 100. But it had become, in the way that some songs do, a song that musicians knew. It was the kind of song that other artists wanted to take a swing at. Diana Ross and the Supremes are going to record it later that year with The Temptations. The band themselves had already turned it into a touchstone, and now Aretha Franklin was going to take it on. She did not need the song. She was at that moment the most important voice in American popular music. She had won 3 Grammy Awards, had been on the cover of Time magazine, and her last 3 Atlantic albums had all gone gold. Wexler had built the Atlantic R&B division around the certainty that whatever Aretha did next would matter, and Aretha, for her part, was not in the habit of recording a song unless she could make it into her own. The Wait was going to be hers. Consider who was in the room that day. Jerry Wexler was producing. Tom Dowd, the man who recorded The Atomic Bomb, the engineer who had designed the very studio they were sitting in, was at the console. King Curtis was on saxophone, Atlantic's secret weapon, the tenor player whose horn lines could rebuild an arrangement around themselves. Roger Hawkins, the Muscle Shoals drummer Duane already knew, was at the kit. Spooner Oldham, also from Muscle Shoals, was at the organ. Jimmy Johnson, another Muscle Shoals refugee, was on rhythm guitar. The rhythm section that Wexler had been quietly importing into New York for the last year was on this day in his New York studio. And Aretha herself, who played piano better than most of the pianists Atlantic could have hired, was at the keys. Duane brought a dobro and a slide. He sat up in the corner of the live room, listened to the band run through the changes once, and then began to thread his guitar through the spaces in Aretha's vocals. When her phrasing went up, he answered low. When she let a line breathe, he filled the silence with a sustained slide note that bent into the next chord change. When she sang the chorus, "And you put the load right on me," he came underneath her with a counter melody that turned the line from a complaint into a conversation. The interplay was not arranged. Galadriel Allman, Duane's daughter, would later write in her memoir of her father that the sound of his slide was well suited to her tone. Their interplay was a conversation. Duane was confident enough to echo the feeling and richness of her voice. Aretha did her part of the conversation in a way nobody had done before. Where the band had let the song amble, she drove it. She pushed the tempo up until the song moved like gospel instead of a campfire folk. And she rebuilt the architecture to match. The Crazy Chester verse came out entirely. And when she reached the final verse, she lifted the whole song up a key underneath herself, the way a preacher raises the room for the last passage of a sermon. Robbie Robertson's song about a stranger getting tangled up in a small town errand became a song about somebody asking for help and meaning it. The sermon that had always been underneath the words came forward. The session went down inside a single afternoon. Tom Dowd cut the master. Aretha listened to the playback, nodded once, and went home. The single was released on the 4th of February, 1969, 26 days after the session. By the end of March, it had reached number 19 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 3 on the Billboard Rhythm and Blues Singles chart, and number 10 on the Cashbox Top 100. It would later be folded into Aretha's 1970 album, This Girl's in Love with You. Duane Allman's name was not on the record. The lead guitarist was listed in the small print as uncredited. He didn't seem to mind. He had been paid the session rate. He had played on a record with Aretha Franklin. He had walked out of Atlantic Studios at 22 years old, having held his own in a room that could have eaten him alive. It would not be the last time he walked down that hallway. 4 months later, in early May 1969, Duane was in a car heading west, back toward Alabama. The Allman Brothers Band had just played its first paid show in Macon, and 6 musicians were sleeping on mattresses on the floor of their road manager's one-bedroom apartment. We'll get to that apartment shortly. The band was beginning to find its sound, and Duane, in the middle of it all, had agreed to give 1 week only, to a session in Sheffield that was being run by a 23-year-old magazine editor. His name was Jan Winter. He had founded Rolling Stone 2 years earlier in 1967, out of a borrowed San Francisco office with 28 pages and a small printing budget. By the spring of 1969, the magazine had survived its first cycle and was growing. Winter had never produced a record in his life. He was a writer and an editor, a man who covered the music business rather than worked in it. But he lived in San Francisco in a neighborhood where his next-door neighbor was a singer named William Royce Skaggs, who went by Boz. Boz Skaggs had spent his previous year and a half as a guitarist and second voice in the Steve Miller Band, playing on the albums Children of the Future and Sailor before leaving to do his own work. He had a demo tape, and when Winter heard it, he carried it east on one of his trips and put it in front of Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records. Wexler liked what he heard and signed Boz to Atlantic. And in a piece of editorial leniency that was unusual even by the standards of that era, he told Winter, who had asked for the chance, that he could produce the record himself. Winter had a hunch about where to make it. He sent Boz down to Alabama with a Rolling Stone press badge so he could visit anonymously, sit in the back of the control room, and watch the players work. Boz spent a week there in February of 1969. He came back convinced. He wanted the new Muscle Shoals sound studio, the rhythm section that had quit Rick Hall's fame the year before, to start their own operation on Jackson Highway. And he wanted Duane Allman on lead. There was one problem. By the time Winter called Muscle Shoals to book Duane had already moved to Jacksonville to form the band. Winter was told that Duane was no longer doing regular session work. Winter called Duane directly. He told him Wexler was involved. He also told him the session was a week, that the rate would be good, that the room was the kind of room Duane already trusted. Duane said yes. He could give them 1 week. He would drive out, and they would have him from Monday morning to Friday night. The session began on the 5th of May, 1969. Muscle Shoals Sound Studio was, in those days, a small concrete block building at 3614 Jackson Highway in Sheffield, just outside of Muscle Shoals. The live room was, in Boz Skaggs' own terms, about the size of a double garage. There was no good way to fit an entire rhythm section, a horn section, a lead guitarist, and a vocalist into the room at the same time without each instrument bleeding into each other. So the room was divided up by improvisation. The horn players were set up in the cloakroom next to the Coke machine with their charts taped to the wall. Boz Skaggs himself was set up in a small back office with a microphone in front of him. The rhythm section, Barry Beckett on keys, Roger Hawkins on drums, and David Hood on the bass, Jimmy Johnson and Eddie Hinton on rhythm guitars, took up the main floor of the live room. And Duane, who needed his guitar isolated and could not or would not turn his amp down, was set up with his amplifier on the tile floor of the bathroom, the door propped open, a microphone cable running across the threshold and into the live room. The hard tile gave his guitar a more reflective acoustic response than the main room could have. The bathroom became, in effect, the first isolation booth in the building, designed by Duane on the day it was needed. The story would later get retold in 100 different forms. He liked it that way. He played out of bathrooms more than once across his career. The album took the week to cut. Boz worked through the songs one at a time, the rhythm section building the tracks underneath his vocals. The album would amount to a survey of the kinds of music Boz had been listening to: Americana, blue-eyed soul, country, rhythm and blues, a Jimmie Rodgers cover, a Bob Dylan cover. But the counterpiece, the song that would justify the album's existence, was a 12.5-minute blues lament called "Loan Me a Dime." The song was not Boz's. He had encountered it the previous year in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at a club show by Elvin Bishop's band. Bishop's vocalist, a singer named Joe Baker, had performed it during the set, and Boz had been struck by it. He didn't know at the time that the song was a 1967 single by a Chicago blues man named Fenton Robinson, originally titled "Somebody Loan Me a Dime," released on the small Palos label out of Chicago. He hadn't tracked down the original record. He had only heard Joe Baker sing it. He remembered the melody and the changes. He didn't remember the lyrics. For Muscle Shoals, Boz placed a long-distance call to Joe Baker in San Francisco. She walked him through the words over the phone. He hung up, went back to the live room, and told the band. It goes like this. It's a minor blues. What happened next, Boz Scaggs has retold several times in the years since, and the retellings agree on the essentials. The band ran through the song once. The first take lasted 25 minutes. Nobody in the control room moved for the duration of it. When it was done, the players got up, walked back into the live room, and asked to run it again. They ran it a second time. By the end of the day, there were nearly 40 minutes of "Loan Me a Dime" on Muscle Shoals tape in 2 long takes. They went into the playback room and sat down and listened to it like people who had just witnessed something. They wanted to release at least 20 minutes of it. The format wouldn't allow them. The album cut was eventually trimmed to 12.5 minutes. The other 27 minutes is still in a tape box somewhere in Sheffield. What ended up on the record is the finest extended blues solo of Duane Allman's session musician career. Boz takes the first 2 verses, then he steps back. Then Duane comes in. The solo builds for nearly 7 minutes, in long, sustained waves. The band locked into the slow minor changes underneath him. Barry Beckett's Hammond organ filling the air, Hawkins riding the snare. Duane goes from B.B. King's clean phrasing to T-Bone Walker's bent intervals to passages that don't belong to anyone but him. Sustained, vocal, building and releasing, taking what Boz had given him and making something larger of it. Boz Scaggs would say later that Duane had a profound effect on the album, and that one of the real revelations of the week was Duane's character, seeing him in the South among players who plainly loved him. In Boz's own words, it was an occasion and a homecoming. They held him in very high esteem. He was the dude. He was the natural leader, and he made everyone else laugh. It was a side I didn't see in Macon, where he was much more serious and focused. And when the album was finished, Boz Scaggs did not go back to San Francisco. He went to Macon, to the town the band Duane wouldn't stop talking about had made its home. He settled in among the band's extended family, and he brought with him a quiet, dark-haired girlfriend named Carmela. Hold on to that name. It will matter later, in ways nobody in that studio on the 5th of May could have predicted. The album was released on the 19th of August, 1969, the day after Woodstock ended. It sold roughly 20,000 copies in its first few years. Loan Me a Dime would not become a hit. It would become instead the kind of record that musicians played for other musicians, an in-the-know reference, a thing you put on at 1 in the morning when you wanted to remind somebody what a guitar could do. 2 sessions, 4 months apart, one in New York, one in Alabama. One backing the most important voice in American music, one backing a young singer who would not become a star for another 7 years. Aretha Franklin's piano, Boz Scaggs' borrowed Chicago blues, King Curtis on the horns, the Swampers in a building the size of a double garage. What needs to be understood about what those two records mean is what they meant in the moment, before anything that came later. Duane Allman, in the spring of 1969, was already a star in the small world that knew who the players were. Wexler had his contract on file. Aretha had asked for him by name. Boz Scaggs had built an album around the possibility of getting him on tape. The phone in Macon kept ringing. He could have stayed in that life for the rest of his career. He would have been, by the standards of session musicians anywhere, a wealthy and respected man. He would have lived in a nice house. He would have played on hundreds of records. He would have been a name musicians said with reverence and listeners said only when they read the small print. He chose instead to put his name on a band. He chose 6 musicians and a town in Georgia that didn't yet know what it had. He chose a brother who had only just come back from California, a bass player nobody outside of Jacksonville had ever heard of, and a second drummer who didn't read music. He chose the harder road. He chose the Brotherhood. And the town he chose to do it in is where this story lives next. Macon, the Brotherhood takes shape. The Allman Brothers Band debuted publicly on March 30th, 1969, at the Jacksonville Armory, just 4 days after their first rehearsal. By May 1st, 1969, Phil Walden had moved them all to Macon. Now, before we talk about what they built here, let's be clear about what they arrived with. No album, almost no money, 6 musicians and a rotating cast of wives, girlfriends, roadies, and hangers-on. Their national profile was non-existent. Their first paid show in Macon was on May 2nd, 1969, at the Library Ballroom on Mulberry Street. And all 6 of them moved into one man's apartment. Their road manager's name was Twiggs Linden, and the road that brought him to the Allman Brothers Band ran through more of American music than most people realize. Twiggs was a Macon native who had served in the U.S. Navy. When he got out, he started his road management career working for Little Richard, another Macon native, and almost immediately stumbled into a piece of music history. In 1965, Twiggs helped a struggling young guitarist named Maurice James audition for Little Richard's touring band, the Upsetters. Maurice James got the gig. He didn't keep it long. Little Richard's brother, Robert Penniman, who ran the tour, fired the young guitarist within months for upstaging the headliner, for playing too loud, too flashy, too much like a man who refused to stand behind anyone else on stage. Maurice James moved on. Within 2 years, he would be on a stage at Monterey, lighting his guitar on fire and rewriting what one man could do with an electric guitar. The world would come to know him by another name, a name you've absolutely heard of before: Jimi Hendrix. But for one brief, strange moment, Twiggs had been there at the very beginning of it. From Little Richard, Twiggs went to road managing Percy Sledge, then Otis Redding, then a Stax Records tour of Europe. By the late 1960s, he was working for Phil Walden Artists and Promotion. Twiggs Linden had quietly become one of the most capable logistics men in Southern R&B. Along the way, on Percy Sledge's tour, he met a drummer named J-Mo, and the two became close friends. J-Mo later said of Twiggs, "I loved him as much as I've loved anyone." That friendship would matter. When Phil Walden started planning a Macon-based studio house band in 1968, an answer to the Muscle Shoals rhythm section, it was Twiggs who invited J-Mo to come up to Macon and join it. J-Mo came. The house band never quite materialized, but J-Mo stayed long enough to head south to Muscle Shoals, where he met a young guitarist named Duane Allman. The rest of that story is in episode 1. When Walden acquired Duane's contract from Atlantic in 1969, he sent Twiggs to Muscle Shoals to fetch him. Twiggs walked into the room, listened to Duane play, and was hooked for life. His brother John Linden later said Twiggs was so excited from the moment he heard Duane. He said these guys loved to play. It's all about the music. He had grown disillusioned with the R&B acts, who he said would walk off stage the second their allotted time was over. Twiggs had finally found musicians who didn't watch the clock. He never went back. When the band moved to Macon in May 1969, they moved into Twiggs' one-bedroom apartment at 309 College Street. Walden bought 5 or 6 double mattresses and laid them on the floors. All 6 band members slept there. They called it the hippie crash pad. Rose Hill Cemetery sat at the bottom of College Street, a short walk from the front door. The cover photo for their debut album would be shot at College House at 315 College Street, the building immediately next door. A story we'll tell properly when the band heads to New York. The wives and girlfriends weren't there yet. They would filter up to Macon over the coming months, but the crash pad was strictly a working musician's boarding house. Nobody held a day job. Nobody could have. Walden's modest salary, the occasional gig, and a small black-owned restaurant a few blocks away on Cotton Avenue that had decided to feed them on credit were their entire financial ecosystem. Locals would drive slowly past the apartment just to look at them. 6 young musicians, 1 black, 5 whites, all with long hair, none of them looking like anything Macon had seen before, sitting on the front steps, playing music at all hours. Whether they meant to or not, they were the most provocative thing on College Street. The band had no money or income, and what money Walden and Capricorn could provide was barely enough to keep them rehearsing and housed. They scraped together what they had to share a meal or two and hoped it stretched. By the time they found Cotton Avenue, they had been doing that for weeks. Cotton Avenue in 1969 ran through the heart of Macon's black business district. H&H Soul Food sat on that street. A former filling station turned into a kitchen by 2 black women, Louise Hudson and Inez Hill, who had opened the place in 1959. Mama Louise was born in Youngstown, Ohio in 1929 and raised from infancy in Warrenton, Georgia. She had moved to Macon in 1952 and worked her way through every kitchen in town before she opened her own. By the time the Allman Brothers Band stumbled in, she had been feeding Macon for 10 years. The story of how they met is well documented now. Dickie Betts and Barry Oakley walked in first, 2 long-haired white musicians in a restaurant that almost never saw white customers in segregated Macon. They ordered 2 plates of food. Then more band members trickled in, and Mama Louise watched from the kitchen as they began very quietly trying to feed 5 or 6 people from 2 plates of greens and smothered fried chicken. Mama Louise didn't say anything to embarrass them. She walked back to the kitchen, fixed full meals for everyone, brought them out, and refused to take their money. "Pay me when you get it." Mama Louise in her own words on what she saw. Macon was just barely integrated. We didn't really have any white customers, and nobody around here had seen guys who looked like them. I had not. A lot of the white folks around here did not approve of them long-haired boys, or of them always having a black guy with them. What she did that day was a quiet act of solidarity that has not always been described that way. 2 communities of outsiders had recognized each other across the segregation line. Scott Freeman, who wrote one of the definitive Allman Brothers biographies, put it like this: "It symbolized how many folks in Macon's black community embraced the Allman Brothers. Like themselves, the band was made of outsiders in mainstream Macon." Roadie Joseph Red Dog Campbell put it more simply: "One of the only places we really felt at home was down at Mama Louise's little restaurant, at the H&H. They didn't care if we were white or black or purple." The credit she extended that first day stretched into the next year, and the next, and the next. The band paid her every time they got home from a tour. When the band hit, they put her on the road with them. They traveled with vats of her black-eyed peas. She became their cook, their road family, and for the rest of her life, the keeper of one of the most photographed kitchen counters in American music. Today, H&H is still there. A 30 by 77-foot mural of Mama Louise and Mama Inez covers the exterior wall, drawn from photographs Twiggs Linden took back in the early days. Inside, the walls hold pictures of Duane Allman, Barry Oakley, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Otis Redding, and Government Mule. Gregg Allman, decades later after that first meal, said it plainly. There is a good possibility that without Mama Louise, there wouldn't be an Allman Brothers Band. Mama Louise passed away in November 2022. She was 93 years old. She had been feeding people for 70 of those years and never stopped. A short walk down College Street, past the front porch of the hippie crash pad, and across a set of railroad tracks, was Rose Hill Cemetery. Rose Hill was not just any cemetery. Opened in 1840, designed by a Macon horticulturist named Simrai Rose, it was one of the first true garden cemeteries built in the American South, modeled after Mount Auburn in Boston, intended from the very beginning to serve as both a burial ground and a public park. 50 acres on a high bluff above the Ocmulgee River, the highest point 142 feet above the water below, a tall arched gate of stone in the Doric order at the entrance. 5 miles of winding gravel roads and footpaths cutting through hills and valleys, doubling back on themselves, following the natural contours of the land. Rustic stone and earth bridges spanning the cemetery's narrow ravines. A long, ornamental pond, 80 yards by 20, ringed with cypress trees and weeping willows, fed by natural springs that bubble up out of the Georgia clay. Towering poplars, oaks, beech, and sycamore. The cemetery's original design forbade owners from clearing the natural forest growth without permission, so the trees that were there in 1840 were still there in 1969, and many of them are still there today. Marble statues of weeping women, stone angels, lambs, and obelisks rise out of the green. The headstones go down the slope toward the river in tiers, terraced like a hillside vineyard. Spanish moss hangs from the oldest branches. The river bends below. The 19th century Macon newspaper account put it simply. All Macon spent an hour or so there. It had been a Sunday destination for over a century by the time the band had arrived. Picnics on the grass between the headstones, long walks along the bluff, lovers meeting on wooded paths, children running in the shade. Rose Hill was, by the deliberate intent of the man who designed it, a place where the living were meant to share the landscape with the dead. The band found it almost immediately. They went there in the daylight to think. They went there at night to drink Ripple and smoke pot and play acoustic guitar in the moonlit shadows of listing tombstones and spreading magnolias. Ripple was a cheap fortified wine made by Gallo, around 11% alcohol, sold in flavors with names like Pagan Pink and Mellow Apple. A bottle cost around $1 in 1969. It was the wine of choice for people who had no money and no pretensions about the wine they were drinking. The Allman Brothers Band qualified on both accounts. They went there to write. Melodies were tried under the trees. Lyrics worked through against the sound of the freight trains coming through Macon on the rail line that run alongside the cemetery. That sound, the long, lonely call of a freight train passing in the middle of the night, the rumble of the cars on iron, lived in the music they were starting to make. You can hear it in the air around their early recordings, even when the songs themselves are about something else. Gregg Allman, decades later, on what happened at Rose Hill in those days, allowed only this. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have my way with a lady or two down there. 6 musicians had moved to a city that didn't know what to make of them, into an apartment that was too small to hold them, with no money and no audience yet. Rose Hill Cemetery was the room they didn't have. It was big and quiet, and the only people in it stopped asking questions a long time ago. The cemetery would, in ways no one in 1969 could have known, become a thread that runs through the entire arc of the Allman Brothers Band history. We will come back to it more than once. When they weren't at the crash pad of the cemetery, the band were rehearsing. Capricorn Sound Studios on Cotton Avenue, Phil Walden's new recording facility, became their second home. The studio had a converted Quonset hut behind the main building that they used as a practice space, day after day, hour after hour. They played in there until the equipment was hot and the windows fogged. They played in front of audiences when they could. May 2nd, 1969 was their first paid Macon show at the Library Ballroom on Mulberry Street. May 4th, 2 days later, they played for free in Central City Park. The next weekend, they drove up to Atlanta and played Piedmont Park. From there, the bookings stretched outwards. Boston in late May, the Boston Tea Party opening for the Velvet Underground, then college shows, ballrooms, anywhere there was a stage and a few hundred people willing to listen. But the most important work happened in private, in the hut behind the studio, in a one-bedroom apartment at 3 a.m. In the long stretches of time when 6 musicians were figuring out who they were as a band by playing together until they couldn't tell who had started a phrase and who had finished. J-Mo described how it worked. They would rehearse a song 4 or 5 times to lock in the arrangement, then play it. Gregg said, "We liked playing together so much, and someone would always come up with a new idea and keep a song alive. Some songs were regular length, but some were real long. That's the foundation underneath the Brotherhood. They were 6 musicians who liked playing together so much that the songs got longer because no one wanted to stop. But the Brotherhood in this band meant something more specific. And this is the part of the story that matters most and gets talked about the least. 6 people had chosen each other. Duane and Gregg were brothers by birth. But the other 4, Barry, Dickie, Butch, J-Mo, they had been asked to be brothers by choice. To take the name, to live it. The Allman Brothers Band was not a name chosen for branding. It was a declaration. Duane Allman had built a band and then named it after a family bond, and in doing so, extended that bond to everyone in the room. These are my brothers, all of them. Duane had his own phrase for what they were. He called them enlightened rogues. It's a phrase that fits. They were rogues, long-haired Southerners, playing music that didn't fit any commercial format, living in poverty in a city that didn't quite know what to do with them. And they were enlightened. They had figured out, before almost anyone else in their generation, that the music they wanted to make required them to refuse most assumptions of the world they had been born into. Barry Oakley said it the way only Barry could. We're doing what we want to do more than anything else, and if we can make a living at it too, that's just beautiful. That's the Brotherhood. 6 musicians pooling money when they had it, sharing food when they didn't, sleeping on mattresses on a floor, working on songs 4 hours a day in a hut behind the recording studio because nobody wanted to be anywhere else. Gregg Allman years later. Everyone told us we'd fall by the wayside down there. They didn't fall. They dug in. And what Capricorn Records and the Allman Brothers Band built together transformed Macon from this sleepy little town into a very hip, wild, and crazy place filled with bikers and rockers. Macon was home, but Macon alone wasn't going to build a band's career. 80 miles to the north, Atlanta in 1969 was a city in the middle of becoming something it had never been before. A southern metropolis with a hippie quarter, a counterculture scene, and a burgeoning music underground that didn't yet have anywhere to play. There were almost no rock clubs in Atlanta in 1969. The city's music infrastructure was built around jazz lounges and R&B revues. So a group of Atlanta musicians built their own stage. They discovered that one of the electrical outlets at a pavilion in Piedmont Park was live. actually wired up and ready. And they started running their equipment off that outlet and playing free concerts every Sunday afternoon. The Atlanta band at the center of it was the Hampton Grease Band, a strange, brilliant, deliberately confrontational outfit led by Colonel Bruce Hampton, a charismatic frontman who had taken the Colonel title for himself and gargled peanut butter on stage during his guitar solos. The Grease Band, like the Allmans, used 2 lead guitarists and long improvised jams. Hampton's signing to Columbia Records would eventually produce one of the worst-selling albums in the label's history, and one of its most beloved cult records. When the Allman Brothers Band started driving up from Macon, they found in Hampton and the Atlanta crowd what they hadn't quite found at home yet: peers. Musicians playing the same kind of music for the same reasons, for the playing itself, with no commercial expectations attached. The Piedmont Park concerts became a Sunday institution. The Allmans played with them. The Hampton Grease Band played with them. The Grateful Dead, when they came through town, played with them too. 2,000 people would show up on a Sunday afternoon for music they could see for free in a park in the South, in a moment when that combination shouldn't have been possible. Colonel Bruce Hampton, decades later, described the era in his own way. It was a different world. It was life or death. He meant it. Atlanta in 1969 was not a hospitable place to be a long-haired musician on a public stage. The Piedmont Park concerts were a small act of resistance dressed up as a free show. They were also where the Allman Brothers Band first started building a Southern following beyond Macon, one Sunday afternoon at a time, in a park where the band that came before them had figured out which outlet was live. The Sunday afternoons in the park, the club dates across the South, the rehearsals in the Quonset hut. All of it had been sharpening a set of songs that didn't exist on tape anywhere. Atlantic Records had paid real money for this band, and by the summer of 1969, the label wanted something it could sell. In August, the band got the word, come to New York. It was time to make a record. Before we go, I need to level with you about something. When I started building this episode, I knew the story of this band's first 2 years were going to be big. What I didn't know was that the story would grow to over 2 hours long, and I wasn't willing to cut it down to fit an hour. Every scene in this story has earned its place, and you deserve to hear all of it. So I've made a decision while editing the video. This episode is now 2 parts, and you've just finished part 1. Part 2 picks up exactly where we're leaving off. The band loads everything they own into a truck and head north to New York City to make their first album, and almost nothing about it goes the way anyone planned. Part 2 will arrive within 2 weeks. If this story is working for you, do me a favor while you wait. Hit subscribe so part 2 finds you the moment it lands. Tap that like button so this story finds other people who'd love it. And drop a comment. Tell me what moment from part 1 stuck with you, because I read every one of them. Also, let me know if you prefer the roughly hour-long episodes, or if you don't mind the idea of an episode that reaches more than 2 hours. Thank you for spending time with me and caring about where this music actually came from. I'm Chris. This has been B-Side Chronicles.